Well, November 2019 has swept in with unexpected Arctic blasts. Sorry, y'all, no fall. Summer hung on and winter has taken over, and thank you to the choir who was able to show up. And you may have noticed a few kids are out sick, a few choir members are out sick. Winter has caught us on guard and taken a few of us out. We are praying for health for everyone. But November is an interesting time of year. November begins this time of the year when we focus on being grateful. And actually, in the church calendar, we have entered the last month of the year. For here, the new year begins with December as we anticipate once again the arrival of the Christ child, beginning of God's presence incarnate in our world, experiencing with us the joys and the sorrows and the challenges and the blessings of this beautiful experience that we call life. So we end the year with gratitude. Last week we started our month of thankfulness with gratitude for the saints who came before us. We'll end this month of gratitude with a Thanksgiving service on the 24th, taking a deep and honest look at what we have to be grateful for. So in these weeks in between, I want to look at the ways and consider how we express gratitude in action in our everyday lives. How do we experience and express gratitude in relationships that are conflictual? Is it even possible to be thankful, maybe not for the conflict, but to be thankful in the midst of conflict, in the midst of those sometimes hurtful and hateful encounters and relationships? Can we step back from the heat of the moment? Can we try to look objectively at the larger picture? Imagine the struggle we are in from a bigger perspective. Can we find a way to find within ourselves the ability to understand and empathize with those who seem to be causing our pain or causing others pain? It's what we want to consider, to look deeply at today. I haven't been teaching classes at the seminary for a while, but I do still get to work with some graduate students and go over their readings with them. And one of the things I love about that is I get an excuse to reread some of those books that I just love and I think are important and got put on the shelf for a while. Recently, I've been rereading the work of John Paul Lederach, a leader in peacemaking around the world. His book, The Moral Imagination, asks the question, how can we transcend the cycles of violence that damage our human community? And he uses one of the best images for community, for relationships, one of my favorite. He talks about the web of relationships. A web like a spider's web, like a net, or maybe a web that develops as someone crochets outward that circular pattern into a beautiful web-like design emerges. And he suggests we need to imagine ourselves in a web of relationships that includes our enemies. No one in reality can be cut out of that web as much as we wish we could sanction some people off. We can't assume that we can just take care of our own and the people we don't like or we don't want to deal with, well, they'll just go somewhere else. This kind of using of our imagination to imagine something more and something different requires that we accept the complexity of life without relying on dualism and polarizing. So he asks us to imagine a spider constructing a web and describe this kind of grateful peacemaking in this way. Spiders are creative. They have to assess their environment. They have to find potential spaces, which you may have noticed when they make a web during the night in your garage and you try to go to the car and suddenly you're walking through a spider web. They've been very creative in finding a way to make that space work and make that web. So then we can maybe imagine people doing the same thing with our relationships, creating positive change in this art of imaginatively weaving relational webs across social spaces social spaces in the midst of conflict. Because all of our lives are a web of relationships. And this is more true and more needed now than ever before. We don't and we can't exist alone as individuals or as families or as ethnic groups or even as nations. For we live in one interconnected ecosystem of air and water and food, and we're all in this together. And unfortunately, violence is perpetuated on the belief that we can get what we need independently of this worldwide web of relationships. So breaking through that belief in violence requires that people embrace this truth that who we are, who we can be in the future takes place through our relational interdependence. Peacemaking involves recognizing our interdependence even with those who are different from us, who think differently, who believe differently, those who may have been polarized as our enemies. Changing the way that we think requires bringing our whole selves into relationship with people who see the world differently. It requires making space in our lives for empathy, for understanding, so that honest exchange of ideas can blossom and grow. And I really think that is what we find in the story that we read from our scriptures today. It's a short story, it's a simple story, and yet it holds so much depth. For Zacchaeus was a Jew, but he was a Jew who collected taxes for the Roman government. He was a traitor to his own people. He skimmed a lot of money off the top as he did it at the expense of the average person. In this crowd, he was hated for his betrayal. He was aligned with their enemies. He was to blame for the pain that their families experienced. But maybe if we are open to empathy, we might realize that to live as an outcast in your own people, with no one to call a real friend, life can be quite painful. To have no involvement with other people except those that want to use you for their own ends. This would have been a lonely and depressing existence for Zacchaeus. So maybe this was really the reason that he wanted so desperately to see Jesus when he came through town. Maybe he thought this teacher could give him a word of hope, that maybe there was a way that life could be different. And we know from our reading of Scripture that is just who Jesus was and just what he did. He had that openness to see into the heart of people, to see into situations that everyone else seemed to miss. He didn't miss Zacchaeus. Luke says he saw him, and he simply said, "Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I will stay at your house today." Seems so simple, but those were words of hope. Those were words of understanding and openness. To be willing to enter into someone's home to share a meal with them was, as everyone knew, a sign of acceptance. Jesus was willing to withhold judgment and hear his story, to learn how he had come to be the person that he was now, to share his pain, even while knowing that he had caused the pain of others. And we don't really know what happened at Zacchaeus' house that night. All we know are the results of what happened. For he makes a pledge to change, to start fresh if people would let him. He promises to give half of his yearly income to the poor and to return any stolen funds 4 times over. Something in that encounter with Jesus changed the way Zacchaeus saw the world. He could now see people in need where before he saw people that he could take something from. And this change probably cost him his job. We don't know how many ways that his life was turned upside down because of this, but we know that he went from being the kind of person that we love to hate to being an amazing example of grace and change and new possibilities. So what does this say to our time and our place and our context and our conflicts? What can we do? I want to share one story that's distant and one that is maybe closer to home. Letter X shares one example of a war-torn place in Kenya near the Somali border. Years of war, people are weary of the conflict. They were tired of the violence and tired of the guns and the intimidation and the fear they lived with. And so in this place and in this time, a group of women decided to start at the center of their relational web, at the center of their lives. They decided that at least the marketplace should be a safe place. Anyone from any tribe or any nation or any background ought to be able to come to the market and get the food they need for their families. So they set up monitors to report around the market if there was any conflict. And they set up a committee to resolve each individual conflict. And they worked together to make their marketplace a safe place in the midst of war. They used their personal relationships, that web that they already had, to convince some of the men to start talking peace. Speak up. Ask the question, who's benefiting from all this fighting while families are being destroyed? They opened this conversation so that those who had been seeking revenge began to seek peace. The women, in grave danger to themselves, went into the bush to talk to the young men who were fighting. They listened to their stories of unemployment, realizing that dealing in guns and fighting was the only opportunity they knew. So the women went back to the people they knew in the community, and they agreed to employ any young man who would turn in their guns and take a job. Lederach describes them in this way: with spider-like creativity and instinctive imagination, the women engaged their environment and their connections that were already there. This way they sought a change in the situation. What promoted war could now promote peace. Not through the elimination of relationships, but rather through the redefinition of the relationships that were there, expanding their web of connections. Now, right here, we're not in the midst of a physical war, but it often feels like we are in a war of ideas that pits us against them, leaving us unable to even speak to anyone who disagrees with us. If we have any hope of changing our world, we have to start with ourselves, with the way that we react when we feel that we are being challenged. An example closer to home, which I've found fascinating recently listening to and reading about. Some of you may know Sarah Silverman, a comedian. You might say she originally gained her reputation for doing some off-color comedy. Her background is Jewish, and she is a vocal advocate for left-leaning political causes. But over the last few years, she's come to realize that our divisive rhetoric and polarized politics are doing more harm than good. So now, in her new comedy show, she's trying to reach out to people from different backgrounds, different places, different points of view, to find common ground, common interests, common experiences, in the hopes that we will recognize how much we are alike, even when we see the world differently. I think one of the best examples of her compassionate peacemaking efforts came in her response to a very negative tweet on her Twitter account. She said she tries not to read all the mean and negative comments she receives because there's a lot of them. She might lose her nerve to say what she believes to be true if she really read every bad thing that people said about her. But this one thing caught her eye. A man had called her a very vulgar name in response to something that she had posted on Twitter. So she said, I clicked on his picture and I read and I saw that all his posts were filled with rage. And then I saw some of his tweets were about suffering from severe back pain. All rage comes from some pain. So I tweeted back and I said, I see that you are in so much pain. This rage is masked pain. I see what you're doing and I know the feeling you are feeling. I have experienced severe back pain too. But I believe in you. See what happens when you choose love. Now, surprisingly, he responded. He said, I can't choose love. A man took that from me when I was 8 years old, and I can't find peace. And I'm poor, so it's hard to find help. So Sarah sent him a list of support groups for sexual abuse in his area. And she was again surprised that he started attending one. And he thanked her for her help. And they've been in contact ever since, emailing, texting, back and forth. They have developed a relationship over time. Sarah Silverman responded to hateful speech with love, and a life was changed. And we know that when one life is changed, many lives are affected as that person's web of relationships reverberates with a new source of empathy and understanding. So now Sarah is determined to find things that bring people together. In her new show, each time she goes to a new place, not to talk about their politics, which they know are completely different, to talk about something else, something that they have in common, something that they can together laugh about so that each side becomes human to the other. She acknowledges when we do this, if there is any condescension in your voice when opening up to people, they can smell it. So you have to mean it without judgment whether they change or not. She said, I'm trying to be my best self. It's a practice. And I love that idea. Trying to be our best self is a practice. And we will slip up, and sometimes we will let the rage win. But then we start again. And we start with gratitude for what we have, gratitude for the people in our lives, both past and present, who heard our pain and showed us empathy and taught us how to love. And then we continue to practice, weaving that web of relationships that makes room for everyone, holding out hope that conflict can be an opportunity for change, or at least a place to create some understanding. So for this web of relationships, we give thanks, this web that began at the heart of God. We are grateful.